Sarah Palin has been embroiled in a lawsuit with the New York Times since 2017, but the former Republican vice presidential candidate may be looking for more than just a payday. In fact, she's perhaps hoping her case lands before the Supreme Court. Now, for context, she sued the New York Times for libel after the paper falsely linked her rhetoric to a mass shooting. In the year since, the case was dismissed in 2022, then revived last year, citing errors by a lower court judge.
The case is set to be retried next month, and the outcome could have far-reaching consequences on the 1964 Supreme Court ruling New York Times versus Sullivan. That decision protected the press by requiring public officials suing for libel to prove that the publisher acted with actual malice. Author of the new book, Murder the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful, David Enrich delves into how Palin's years-long battle against the paper could overturn decades of Supreme Court precedent. Joining us now to discuss is David himself, who is also business investigations editor at the New York Times. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, did I pronounce your last name right or wrong? Is it Enrich or Enrich?
The latter, enrich, to enrich your morning.
Excellent.
Or uranium.
Well, well, that's an easy way to remember it, and we'll keep that in mind. So tell us what the central thesis of your book is regarding this Sarah Palin case.
Well, the central thesis of my book in general is that there are a lot of very rich and very powerful people out there trying to shut down critical coverage of themselves in the media or just among normal citizens who speak up on social media or in any other forum. And the Palin case is interesting to me in part because she has seized on litigation against the New York Times, not only to kind of shoehorn herself back into the national conversation, but she and her lawyers have dreams of maybe one day her case makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court and becomes a vehicle to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan, which protects the rights of all people, including journalists, to speak freely and investigate and interrogate people who hold power without fear that making an innocent mistake or getting a fact wrong will subject them to kind of being sued into oblivion. And so the Palin case is kind of this unlikely vehicle because she has lost at trial. She has lost on motions to dismiss, but the case keeps getting sent back for retrials and reconsideration because of some errors by the federal judge presiding over it. And, I think it's anyone's guess how this goes. The trial's supposed to restart for the second time next month in April, and it will be very interesting to see if it unfolds the way it did the first time when the jury fairly quickly ruled in favor of the Times and against Palin.
Yeah, I mean, you say innocent mistake. Obviously, the issue for viewers is that there was this editorial that said there was a clear and direct link between the graphic published, I think, on behalf of a political action committee for Palin with the bullseyes over certain districts, that there was a clear and direct link between that and the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords, something that by the time they said that had been known for years to be not the case, that this had not been seen by the shooter, that his motives were not at all connected to that or are even really coherent in a political agenda-driven.
And that's totally
way.
right.
Yeah. So now, look, I'm like yourself, a big free speech person. I'm kind of skeptical of libel and defamation overall. Niall and I argue about that all the time, and the court determined this doesn't meet the definition of libel. But it's a rather sympathetic case for Palin, is it not?
Not from my perspective, no. But look, I'm biased. I work at the New York Times, and I recognize and acknowledge that bias. I mean, look, the Times definitely got it wrong. We published an editorial. This is before I even worked at the paper, for whatever it's worth, and we got some facts wrong, or we made some kind of incorrect insinuations and assumptions. And within 12 hours, don't hold me to that. It was something like 12 hours or 15 hours of the editorial being published late at night. It was corrected. The Times apologized for it. But it's not up to me or to you or anyone else to say whether that meets the definition of an innocent mistake. That's for a judge and a jury to decide. And a judge and a jury did decide, and they both agreed that this did not fit the definition of a case that a public figure like Sarah Palin should be able to win. Now, as we said, that case, it's being sent back for a retrial. And so we'll see what the jury has to say. But the idea behind New York Times versus Sullivan and some subsequent cases is that it's important that journalists and everyone else have the ability to aggressively scrutinize, criticize, interrogate people who hold a lot of power in our country. And if they are fearful that a simple mistake that they do not intend to commit, but they do anyway, is going to open them up to litigation, that the concern that the Supreme Court has repeatedly articulated over the years, and that I happen to agree with, is that that can create a real chilling effect and lead journalists and members of the public, regardless of their politics, whether they're right, left, center, somewhere else, to have a chilling effect and lead them to pull punches. And one of the things I spent a lot of time doing in the book is highlighting how this is not something that doesn't just protect journalists, it protects everyone. And there's a very rich history, fairly recently, of this protecting conservative voices, conservative activists, conservative journalists. So it's really not, I mean, the New York Times is obviously, I think, in a lot of people's eyes, this kind of bastion of liberal media. Again, I don't quite see it that way, but I recognize that is the perception. But it does not just protect the New York Times, it protects anyone who wants to speak out in public.
David, let me broaden this conversation because, as Robbie mentioned previously, he and I have disagreements about this that cross peculiar lines. And as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in a place that has stricter libel and defamation laws. And sometimes I'm not generally all that eager to defend Sarah Palin herself for various reasons. But the paradigm that you and most journalists in this country believe, which is that that this is a protection offered to fearless investigators in the media so that powerful people can be held to account, it seems to me to confuse a few things, or at least have some debatable contentions, because whether it's the New York Times or Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, the media itself has very considerable power. And should the bar be as high for people in public life to sue for defamation? Should you have to prove actual malice, which is often a near impossible standard to meet, when in fact the media can do people very legitimate wrongs by factual errors that would be, on the other side of the Atlantic, held to be defamatory?
Well, look, again, I'm biased here. I definitely think the answer is yes. I guess reasonable people can disagree about that. There are a few things I would, respectfully disagree with in how you just described that, though. I mean, first of all, people who are trying to weaken New York Times versus Sullivan or overturn it like to say that it sets a nearly insurmountable bar to winning cases, but that's just not true. I mean, there are many cases very recently where public figure plaintiffs have successfully sued news outlets on both the right and kind of the mainstream media for defamation. And there's CNN just got sued and lost in a case down in Atlanta. Fox News was sued for its role in lying about the 2020 elections by Dominion. It lost. And there are a whole lot of other cases kind of over the years that illustrate that while it is a high bar, it is not an insurmountable one. But in any case, I mean, to me, the question isn't about the protections that the New York Times or CNN or Fox News deserve. It's because, look, we all have big legal departments. We have, relatively speaking, a lot of money and a lot of experience dealing with this. To me, this is much more about voices that do not have that backing. And again, it's voices on both the right and the left and anywhere in between. And the book details like numerous cases where people with a Substack newsletter or a podcast, or who aren't even journalists at all and just are activists. And there's a case where a conservative activist who was campaigning against women serving in combat roles in the US military nearly got sued to death because of something she had written based on Pentagon sources. And, she got some facts wrong, and she almost lost that libel case, even though the facts, the mistakes were honest ones and innocent ones. The report that she published had a very negative impact on a female fighter pilot in the US military who sued. And because of New York Times versus Sullivan, this conservative activist, her voice was protected. And again, I've seen that over and over and over again, generally not with, mainstream, like national mainstream media outlets that people on both the right and left like to see in kind of highly politicized terms. This is much more often affecting local journalists who work for like a town newspaper or independent journalists who have a Substack newsletter and make the mistake about writing something negative and nasty about like a local business or something. And that to me isn't about the power imbalance. There is actually the opposite of what you're describing. It's often that the powerful local interests that they are writing about are the ones with the power, whereas the journalists or the kind of community activists and whatnot are the ones that are on their own and getting just sued into oblivion by people with a lot more money and resources than they have.
Yeah, despite being the right-leaning duo in this debate, I largely agree with you, and I tell people in conservative circles that they always imagine this, or the ones who want stricter libel standards or whatever, they imagine that that's going to be bad for the mainstream media. But the format in which so much right-wing thought is succeeding now, right? Podcasts, Substack, alternate platforms are very free-flowing and unfiltered, are the exact kind of things that under a standard by which it was easier to sue people for speech, that this whole ecosystem would be under I think even graver threat than the mainstream ecosystem. We unfortunately have to leave it there, but it sounds like a really fascinating book. Thank you for coming on Rising to talk about it.
My pleasure.
Next up, billionaire versus billionaire. We'll fill you in on what that means. Stay tuned.